Welcome to Secure Software Development. We're going to begin the same way we always begin, by talking about randomness. What makes something random? Well, we can think of an experiment and then think of the outcome of the experiment. If the experiment surprises us, then we can think of that as something that is, perhaps random, perhaps. If it keeps surprising us, right, if every time we run the experiment, the result is not what we predicted, then yeah, that begins to seem like something that is random, right? So the first time it might surprise you, but from then on, you know what to expect, and you can always predict the result. That's not random. But if you can't predict the result, then it seems like it's going to be random. Can we make this idea formal? And the answer is yes, we can. So suppose you have an experiment like rolling a die, or maybe several of them. So a single fair die would give you 6 equally likely outcomes, 1 through 6, and each outcome has probability 1/6. Now, if I hold the die and I say, I am going to roll a 4, and I roll the die and I get a 4, you're going to be like, yeah, but you had a 1 in 6 chance of guessing it correctly. So 1 out of every 6 times, you're going to get it right. Now let's get extreme and suppose I have a 2,000-sided die. Just pretend. Each outcome has a much lower probability, assuming it's a fair die. That's 1 in 2,000. In this case, I pick up the die. I confidently say I'm going to roll a 4. I roll a 4. Now you're like, how could you have known? Right? This seems much more surprising. So there you go. This would seem to indicate that the more unlikely an outcome is, the more surprised we are by it. Now, I want you to be careful. Every time I roll that 2,000-sided die, the outcome has a 1 in 2,000 chance. So every time I roll it, I get what would seem like a very unlikely outcome. But I will get one out of these outcomes. The trick is I didn't try to predict it. All right, so let's make up some rules to help us out here. So let's invent a function. Let's call it the surprise function S. And the surprise function will take a probability. And we'll say this is the amount of surprise that's associated with observing an outcome that has probability P. And let's just say, what are some things that we think about that? Well, we'd like the function to maybe be monotonically decreasing. That is, as the probability goes up, our surprise goes down. Right? So if the chance is 1 in a billion and we observe it, okay, then that's a bit of a surprise. If the chance is nearly 100% and we observe it, we're like, yeah, sure, that was going to happen. And that leads us to the second case. Events that always occur convey no information. Right? I mean, I didn't learn anything by observing something that I absolutely expected to happen, and then it happened, and I'm like, yep, that happened. I didn't learn anything from that. No information was conveyed. So for our function, we actually do have one concrete value. We can say S of 1 is 0. And then, as a third rule, if we have 2 different experiments running, and the experiments are independent of one another, we don't expect them to interact or influence each other, my amount of surprise in the outcomes of the 2 experiments would be how surprised am I at the outcome of the first one, plus how surprised am I at the outcome of the second one. So we could say that the surprise associated with the joint experiment is just the sum of the surprises of the independent experiments. Given these 3 rules, can we find a function that satisfies these requirements? Maybe there are lots of functions, right? Maybe there aren't any, but can we find one that satisfies these 3 seemingly reasonable, I think these are reasonable requirements? And the answer is there's exactly one. This was proven by Claude Shannon in his very, very famous paper. and the function turns out to be the log of the reciprocal of the probability. There you go. Now, the choice of the logarithm base is the same as multiplication by constant. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, right, if my surprise, what's my metric for that? It's like 5. Is 5 big? Is it small? I don't know. I could scale it so that my surprise fits in some range, right? My surprise could be 0 to 1, or it could be 0 to 100, or it could be 7 to 19. I mean, I don't know, right? The point is, I'm changing the scale, but I'm not actually changing the value of it relative to that scale. And that's what a change in the base of the logarithm does. If you want to go through the details of that, I'll do that with you, but you should have learned that in high school. We can choose whatever base makes sense for us. Now, Shannon named this idea entropy because it has the same mathematical formulation as entropy from statistical mechanics, or at least it has one that's very common for that formulation. And we usually don't represent it as S, we usually represent it with an H. So the higher the entropy, the greater the surprise at an outcome. Another way to think of entropy, when we use base 2, is that it's the minimum average number of yes-no questions that you need to completely determine the outcome. Now, you may be hung up on the words minimum average number. What does that mean? Well, think about a guessing game, okay? So let's suppose that I pick a number from 1 to 16. And then you're going to guess. And so let's say you start out guessing 8, higher or lower or exact. And so I tell you it's higher. And then you're like, okay, so halfway from 8 to 16, where is that? It's around 12. I'm going to guess 12. I say lower. And you're like, okay, halfway between 8 and 12, I'm going to guess 10. Higher. Okay, now it's 11. So in general, the number of questions I can ask from that, right, there's a minimum number. And if I did this a whole bunch of times and I chose the best strategy, I would get an average of these different minimum, right? I mean, I could be pathological and crazy and I could say, I guess 1, then a 2, then 3. That's going to be a terrible strategy, right? So the entropy we can think of as the minimum number of questions I have to ask to determine an outcome. And I said base 2. I could use other bases, and I could have more varied outcomes to the question. And then I can ask fewer questions, right? So if I can ask you, for my little example of choosing the number 1 to 16, if I can ask you a question that has 16 possible different outcomes, maybe I can always get it in one question, right? Like I say, what's your number times 2? I'm like, it's 4. And you're like, well, your number's 2. Right? So there you go. So this is a pretty neat idea. It's used everywhere. And we measure random things for things that we want to be random or hope might be random or think are random by using entropy. For example, let's say that you want a truly random 64-bit integer, okay? Then what you need is a process that yields 64 bits of entropy. That is the log base 2 of the process. And we sometimes write log base 2 as just LG is 64. Now, if you have a random process with less entropy, you might still be able to get a 64-bit random value, but the bits may not be fully independent, and so the result will be less random. I mean, one way to get, let's say I just give you a 32-bit random value, but I need 64 random bits. So what I do is I just duplicate the bits. In that case, the high bits are just duplicates of the low bits, and they're completely dependent. But I might give you like 62 bits of randomness, and I give you back a 64-bit value. In that case, maybe 2 of the bits could be written as functions of the other 62 bits. So there's something a little bit less than fully random present in there. How do we implement this on computers, right? How do we get randomness on a computer? Well, we need a process that yields enough surprise to meet our needs. And one way to do this is to maybe hide part of the outcome of an otherwise regular process. So if you look at the numbers over on the right, actually more in the middle of the screen, they look pretty random, right? 311, 784, 257, 730, 203. Wait a minute. You might notice odd, even, odd, even. Something seems a little bit weird here. Well, it turns out that that's just the last 3 digits of a sequence. And in this case, I just take 1,473, multiply it by the number in the sequence, and there you go. So the numbers aren't really random as such, right? They can look random and they can seem random, and we call that pseudo-random. And this is a pretty simple idea known as a linear congruential random number generator. In this case, I did that. It's linear, and in fact, I did do modular arithmetic. I just modded it by 1,000. In reality, you wouldn't use something that obvious, so you wouldn't get that staggered odd, even. But you would still, if you were to plot them in the right way, you would still see emergent properties like striping and so forth, because they are, in fact, is a regular pattern to them. But this is a way to do it. And modern random number generators, cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generators, use a number of techniques to systematically generate a sequence of numbers that look random. They look sufficiently random. But I still have the problem that if I know the sequence, I may be able to go and find a location in that and then tell you what it is. So one thing we might do is start the sequence at a random place. So instead of always starting at the same location, we might start at a random location, and we call this a seed. And so on the right there, I've added a seed to it. I've added 1321 to it. I still get that odd, even pattern, but you can see it's not the same sequence as it was previously. I've got a new sequence of numbers, and once I lop off the first 2 digits, it's going to still look pretty random. Now, it's hard to get a good source of pure entropy. It really is. And it's hard to get a source of entropy with high bandwidth. So you can go online now, and you can go to sites that will give you random numbers. They can be based on atmospheric noise or other kinds of processes that we think are essentially random. But they don't produce high volumes of random numbers quickly. And you might need that for something like a video game, for certain kinds of Monte Carlo simulations. So what we need is a high bandwidth random number generator. Well, a pseudo-random number generator, like we see on the right there, that's fast. That's super fast. The problem is it's not truly random. So what we need to do is combine the 2 approaches. So we use our true entropy source, whatever it is, to get a seed, and then we use our pseudo-random generator based on that seed to rapidly get a sequence of pseudo-random numbers. And that's the technique we use all over the place. So if this process yields, let's just say, 32 bits of randomness, and perhaps we're seeding it with a 64-bit integer, but ultimately just get 32 bits of randomness, then we would hope that the seed we use also has about 32 bits of entropy, hopefully more, right? More entropy is better. It's certainly better than less entropy, right? If the seed that we chose only had 16 bits of entropy, then we would only ever be able to generate 65,000 different random sequences. And that's not a lot in computer terms, right? So we want it to be 32 or more bits of real randomness, right? If it's just 16, that's the kind of thing that we can directly attack, right? We can build a rainbow table. We identify which sequence you're on, and then we can predict all the future random numbers, because after the seed, you're not random anymore. You're now in this sequence of producing pseudo-random numbers. So the seed is important. We want that to be random. So let's change topics a bit, and let's mention a tool called Valgrind. Some of you may have used Valgrind. Valgrind's a tool that a lot of folks use. It's a static analysis framework that checks for memory problems, right? So I run it over my code, and it says, hey, you have a potential problem here. Maybe using uninitialized memory. Maybe you are using this after you freed it. Maybe you are leaving pointers around to it. So, like a lot of tools, it can generate some false positives, and that's a concern. So back in 2006, going way back for this, 2006. Back in 2006, a Debian developer went on OpenSSL Dev, right, the mailing list for people who are maintaining the OpenSSL secure socket layer libraries, so cryptographers. And he said, hey, I have a problem. I am trying to work with this code, but Valgrind is giving me a lot of warnings about the use of an uninitialized value. These uninitialized value warnings are coming from where I'm using the random number generator, and the idea is it's adding an uninitialized buffer to the pool. What is the pool? Well, the pool is basically me seeding the random number generator. So I want to generate a seed for the random number generator, and I use MD update to add that buffer to it. But Valgrind is saying, hey, that buffer is not fully initialized. All right, so that's bad. Well, if it's not fully initialized, maybe it doesn't matter. And on line 467, I see this, if not define purify, then do it. Otherwise, in it says purify complaints. Purify is another tool, commercial tool in this case, for doing the same kind of thing as Valgrind. So here I've already commented it out in one place. And so he says, what I currently see as the best option is to comment out those two lines of code. But I'm not a cryptographer. I don't know what effect this might have on the random number generator. The only effect that I see is that the pool might receive less entropy. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how much entropy some uninitialized data has, right? Remember, it's telling us that buffer is uninitialized. If it's not even initialized, maybe it's all zeros, and it doesn't matter because I'm not actually adding any entropy. So he says, what do you people think about removing those two lines of code? And he got back a few replies, and you can read them if you go to, there's a link in the notes for this slide that will take you to this conversation on there. You can read the replies he got back from some of the experts on here, right? The way to know for sure what you're doing is to ask the experts, and he did. And they said, it's fine. You can remove those lines, no problem. Great, I'll remove them. And the removal of those two lines does, in fact, remove the use of some uninitialized data. But see, here's the trick. Only part of the buffer was uninitialized. The other part had data from Dev Random, which is our source of true random numbers. So the random seed was actually thrown away by commenting these lines out. Without the random seed, the only thing that was being used was the process ID. So that maybe that's good, but it turns out that at the time, back in 2006, process IDs were limited to just 32,000 values, or about 2 to the 15th. Remember earlier I said 2 to the 16th was a bad idea? 2 to the 15th is a worse idea. So you get 15 bits of randomness, and that's not enough. That means you're only on one of 32 to 33,000 different chains, and you can go and find it. And you don't have to work hard for it because it turns out it's just the process ID that called it. So you know what it is. All right, well, XKCD made some fun of this. The bug was introduced in 2006. 2 years later, it's patched. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, the implications of this are lots of things that depend on randomness. Most of them, other cryptographic libraries, things with certificates, that kind of stuff, those are all broken because of this. And that's very bad. That seriously compromises security. Luckily, it was patched in 2008, so that problem was gone. And, maybe it would have been nice if someone had noticed it. At the bottom, you see the CVSS for it, 7.5. Now we're back to not being Olympic level stuff, but still not great, right? It's regarded as high. If only somebody noticed. So Ray Finney in his blog says, hey, I discovered the Debian OpenSSL bug, and I didn't tell anyone because I didn't actually know what was going on. What he saw was lots of certificates that were the same. And he was like, why are all these certificates the same? I don't understand. Okay. But all right. So then later on, the bug comes out and he realizes that's what I was seeing. He wrote a blog post about it. The bug is CVE 2008-0166, right? 2008, because that's when it was reported and then patched. All right. But he makes a straight comment here, which is maybe worth looking at. He said this was a Debian-specific OpenSSL vulnerability which had been in place for nearly 2 years and is still being exploited in the wild to this date. When is he writing this blog post? He's writing it earlier this year. He's writing it in 2024. 2024? Really? Yes, 2024, really. There's a web page out there that you can go to that celebrates the long-running exploitation of this OpenSSL bug. 16 years of CVE 2008-0166 in 2024. So there you go. It's still being exploited. What can we learn from all this? Well, we can learn a few things, right? We're going to repeat the mantra until you get tired of hearing it. Every system is vulnerable. Okay? Sometimes you can't even trust the experts. Life's hard. The guy did the right thing. He went on to the site and he said, what does this mean? Can I do this? Is this okay? And they're like, thumbs up, buddy. Go do it. Sometimes the tools are going to get in the way. Valdrine and others, they're throwing all these problems at you. What are you going to do? You got to get some stuff done. So you just do something to satisfy the tool and move on. And you know what? Life's hard. And the last point, vulnerabilities can live on for a shockingly long time. No matter how bad it was, somebody just ain't patching it, and it's still, because it's still being exploited, you can be sure there's enough stuff out there with this vulnerability in it that it's worth exploiting. Great. I'm not going to go into any more depth in any of this. I think you get the point. Let's switch and let's talk about attack trees. So first, let's actually think about what an attack is. An attack is the use of an exploit, maybe multiple exploits, by some adversary to take advantage of weaknesses with the intent of achieving, we'll call it, a negative technical impact, right? They want to do something that maybe you don't want them to do. And so your security is in place to prevent that, but your security has a weakness or maybe multiple weaknesses. And by exploiting those weaknesses, they're able to create an exploit and get through your defenses. An attack is part of the bigger cyber attack life cycle. What is that? Well, we tend to think of there as being a life cycle. An attacker comes along and they want to do something. So they gather information, right? What version of software are you using? What ports are open? What have you got installed? Oh, do you have this kind of software installed? that has a known vulnerability, okay, well, I care about that. So they do reconnaissance of your systems. Then they figure out, these are the vulnerabilities that are present in those various systems. Is there a way I can combine them? And I build the different vulnerabilities, different exploits for those into a weapon. I then deliver that, exploit your system, assume control, execute whatever task I want to execute, and then perhaps as well, I do something to persist or maintain my presence in your system so I don't have to go through all this work again. I can just hop in whenever I want to. An attack pattern is a description of the common attributes and approaches employed by adversaries to exploit known weaknesses in a system. Not necessarily a cyber-enabled system, just any old system, okay? That's an attack pattern. And attack patterns define the challenges an adversary faces and how they go about addressing those challenges. This is going to make more sense in just a minute. This derives from this concept of design patterns. So you are maybe familiar with the idea of design patterns in software. Well, there are also attack patterns, right? Composable elements of attacks that can be put together by your adversary to exploit your system. In fact, we can go ahead and write some of these down. And MITRE, in addition to the CWE, the CVE, everything else they're doing, they have the Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification, or CAPEC. And in a sense, you can think of this as similar to the way STRIDE works. So STRIDE was a list of common violations of security properties, right? CAPEC is more fine-grained. So if you look over on the right, you can see engage in deceptive interactions. Right? Maybe they're spoofing something. Maybe they're doing some social engineering. Abuse existing functionality, manipulate data structures, manipulate system resources, inject unexpected items, right? These are more fine-grained things than what we saw in STRIDE. Okay? You can view this collection of attack patterns in a bunch of different ways. So up at the top, we see mechanisms of attack. Below it, we see domains of attack, right? I can attack the software, the hardware. I can attack the communications. I can go after the supply chain. I can use social engineering. I can try to subvert your physical security. And each one of those, you see, has a number of things underneath it. Lots of things underneath it. Again, a huge collection of things. You probably can't read this and consider every single one of them. Now, CAPEC is one of a family of attack libraries, okay? There are many of these out in the world, but this is one of the most commonly cited ones. All right. Weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and exploits. Threat modeling identifies weaknesses throughout your system. That's the point of it. But it doesn't necessarily combine those into a complete exploit. What do I mean by that? Your focus is on catastrophizing. You're saying, hey, this might be a weakness. This might be a weakness, right? A weakness anywhere gets included in the threat model. But the attacker doesn't get to just poke at every single little thing. Security is contextual, right? They're coming at it with some mission in mind, and they have to get through maybe the first layer before they get through other things, right? They may have to get through a firewall before they can exploit this piece of software. So saying, oh, there's a vulnerability in this software, okay, but maybe it's protected by other layers, or maybe there are other things, right? We talked about the idea of unexploitable vulnerabilities. So everything is contextual. That's something you have to keep in mind. So threat modeling is this process of catastrophizing, but maybe we should think a little bit about the context as well. And a way to do that is to think about the path that an intruder might take to exploit your system. Okay? Attacks and security depend on context. So over on the right, there we go. Look at that. Someone has written the password on a Post-it note and stuck it to a monitor, like you do. And okay, is that a problem? Maybe it's a solution to a problem, right? The actual security of your system depends on the path the intruder takes. A computer with a weak password, or in this case, a password on a Post-it note, might be secured by other means. It could be disconnected from the network and behind a locked door, in which case you have substituted the security of the password with physical security. Okay, maybe that's sufficient for what you're doing. And maybe the fact that there's a weakness, a password that's been disclosed, doesn't matter, because in order to read the password, you first got to break into a locked room. So the security of a system depends on the path the intruder takes. Keep repeating that. The off-network computer locked behind the door is secure against remote hacking, right? There's no path on the network that reaches the computer because the computer's not on the network. Now, it may or may not be secure against an attacker with physical access to the building where the computer is located, right? Maybe the attacker can go and pick the lock and get into the room and do something. Or maybe it would be hard to do that because there are security guards, there are cameras, there's motion detectors, etc. So what we need to do is think about the steps in getting the access that we want or that an attacker wants. So here we're going to start with the goal. We're going to say, what do I want to do? And so up at the top, we write down our goal. I want to access that computer. And then we think about the different ways we might go about doing that. Right? So one way is maybe we get remote access. Another way is maybe we get physical access to it. Those are different possibilities. And so we write them down. How do I get physical access? Well, I have to open the door. Okay? How can I open the door? Well, I could maybe get the key. Okay? Maybe the janitor leaves the keys lying around and I can grab the key or make an impression of the key. Maybe the janitor takes the keys home at night and I can reduce my problem of breaking in the room with the computer to breaking into the janitor's house, because maybe that's easier. Maybe I can piggyback. So what is piggybacking? That's the idea that someone goes through a door and you go through right behind them. You piggyback on their access. Maybe I can pick the lock. Or even better, maybe I can blackmail somebody into letting me into the room. That seems like it might be possible. So some steps in this little tree that we've built have concrete actions, right? I'm going to blackmail the guy. I'm going to break into the house and steal the key. I'm going to pick the lock, right? Those are things that have concrete actions. And they lead to goals like opening the door, which supports the goal of physical access, which achieves my overall goal of accessing the computer. Now, if something is impossible or wildly impractical, I eliminate it, okay? And then whatever's left is my plausible set of attacks. In this case, I decide I probably can't get the key, there's an anti-piggybacking policy, and I don't have any dirt on the security guard. It turns out the computer's not on the network, so I mark all those off and I find out that I have to pick the lock in order to open the door to get physical access to the computer. If you know, or if you think you know, the probability of success, you can include that on the links to the leaf nodes, on the links to the nodes that have concrete actions. So you see down at the bottom, getting the key, I might have like a 10% chance of getting the key. I have no chance of piggybacking. Again, there's a policy, they're watching for that. Maybe a 10% chance of getting some dirt on the janitor and successfully blackmailing him. And maybe a 50% chance of picking the lock. Maybe I'll pick the lock, maybe I won't. I can try, and I'm going to give myself a 50-50 chance of being successful at that. Okay? So I can now populate these probabilities upward and see what I get. How do I do that? Well, I know that there's a 10% chance of succeeding here. So there's a 90% chance that I fail here. 0% chance, so 100% chance I fail. 50% chance I fail, 90% chance I fail. I can take all of these and compute my overall probability of failure, subtract it from 1, and when I do that, I get 59.5. So there is pretty good chance that one of these will get me through. Overall, I have about a 60% chance of opening that door. That's great. So I can populate that on up, 59.5, that's a 0. So I'm still at 59.5. So what you see here is that even unlikely methods, like getting the key, that might happen. And it contributes something to my overall probability of success. You might have thought, well, it's just 50% because that's the highest. No, I have other options. Maybe while I'm learning to pick the right kind of lock, I'm also seeing if the janitor leaves a key around, or if I find out something that I can use to blackmail him. So this is an attack tree, and Bruce Schneier is often regarded as the father or kingpin or whatever of attack trees. But it's probably the case that the NSA developed attack trees, and it's probably not the case that they developed it. It's more likely the case that they emerged from threat trees, which were studied by Jonathan Weiss at Bell Laboratories back in the 1980s, which he then published about in 1991. Or maybe go all the way back to fault trees. In the 60s, fault trees were used for diagnosing problems with missile launches. But we can actually go further back, and we can find this kind of diagnostic tool being used in World War II. So it's been around a long time. The basic idea that I want to think about things this way goes way back. But Bruce Schneier often gets the credit. And so we can go and pick on some of the stuff that he's done. Here's an example from one of his papers on attack graphs. And we see up at the top, I want to open a safe. I want to get into that safe because there's something in there that I want. So I might pick the lock on the safe. I might learn the combination. I might cut the safe open. Or I might be the safe installer, and I might get to do some, get hired to install the safe, in which case maybe I'll install it with a back door so that I can get into the safe later on. So I think about each one of those, and I divide and conquer. I'm thinking like an attacker. So maybe my main goal, maybe the thing I think I'm most likely to do is to be able to learn the combination. Maybe somebody wrote it down and stuck it in a drawer or stuck it on a Post-it note, maybe on the safe itself. I don't know. But maybe I can find a written combo. Maybe I can get it from a target, right? I go to the manager, or I go to the security guard, or I go to someone else that I think has it, and I threaten them. Okay, maybe they're not that intimidated. I blackmail them. Maybe I have something on them. Maybe I just give them money, right? Money solves a lot of problems. I just bribe the guy. All right, fine. There we go. Or maybe I eavesdrop, right? I listen to conversations, or I find a way to get the target to state the combination, right? So I'm thinking like an attacker, and that's helpful from the point of view of me learning what the threats are to the system, because now I'm doing this in some context. Just like before, I can annotate this. Before I annotated it with probabilities, here I'm annotating it with money, right? I need to pick the lock. A lock pick set, a really nice one, is going to cost me like $30. I'm going to cut the safe open. I'm going to need a lot of money for that. Install it improperly, maybe I need $100,000 for that. Oh, it's $30K. So I gotta only buy the lock picks. I gotta practice with them, which takes time. And so maybe overall, I end up spending a lot of money on that. Finding the written combo, maybe that cost me some money. Threatening the guard, blackmailing the guard, or bribing the guard, those cost money. Bribing him's pretty cheap. It's looking like a good option. And so maybe what I do as I've annotated these is I say, you know what, I think these are the real costs. I'm going to design my security to guard against attacks that cost under 20K. Maybe that cost 20K or less. So I'm going to not worry about blackmail, but I will worry about people taking bribes. I won't worry about someone coming in and installing the safe incorrectly, but I will worry about someone cutting the safe open. Helps me prioritize my security. We could annotate the graph with whether special tools are needed, right? So I might need drills or lockpicks. I might want to hire some thugs to beat up somebody for me, right? That's a get the target to state the combo. It's going to cost me 40K because I'm going to hire me some thugs and they're going to beat the combination out of you. Okay. But let's go and take a closer look at this. And instead of attack trees, let's think about attack graphs. So one of the things about this little path, right, we figured out that the 59.5% chance of success. What if I do it and I fail? I fail to get into the computer. But I can try again. So I do try again. It turns out if I try this just 3 times, my probability of success exceeds 93%. Just trying this 3 times, assuming that they're independent, identically distributed trials, I'm gonna get in. That's pretty powerful. This notion of iteration is very powerful. And attackers do that, right? They have the ability to iterate attacks. Also, if we think about the cost, the first time through, I have to buy stuff and learn stuff. But the second time through, I don't have to buy that stuff because maybe I already have it. I already know the stuff I needed to learn, so the cost goes down. And that illustrates an important principle, which is that in general, the cost of attacks is always decreasing. It's always going down. And as an example of that, I give you the Flipper Zero. $169 gets you a Flipper Zero today. Free shipping. And over on the left-hand side, a little video clipped out, a YouTube short of someone using the Flipper Zero to take control of Teslas. Fun stuff. There are longer videos of it online as well that you can find. So now I've added a loop. So you look at the bottom, I see retry, and that takes me all the way back up to my original task of trying to access the computer. So now I can iterate. Okay, I'm no longer a tree, right? Because I don't have this strict, one-way paths. I'm now a more general category. It's a graph. This is an attack graph. The structures become more complex. If the probabilities on this don't change, then the expected number of times I have to go through this graph and try is 1.7. So that means that on average about 2 times that I'm in. Every piece of information you add to a security model is going to increase the apparent utility of the model. You're going to think, I'm going to add money to this. I'm going to add probabilities to this. I'm going to add other information like tools and so forth to this. That's good. That can make the apparent utility of the model higher. It looks like it's a better model because it has more information in it. However, how much do you actually know about that? Do you know the probability actually that you can pick the lock? Do you know how long it will take you to pick the lock? Maybe you do. Maybe you've practiced with that particular lock, but maybe you're guessing. As you pile up guesses, Okay, eventually the errors in those become greater than the result, and you're just wrong. You're just wrong. So adding lots of information to a security model, while it does increase the apparent utility, can also lead you to self-deception, and you can make bad security decisions because of it. So the advice is keep your model relatively simple so that you can see all the parts, understand what those parts are, and be reasonably sure that you have done the right stuff. And you should document this. If you know how long it takes to do something or what the probability is, document that you know, and document how well you know, so that you, or someone else coming along later, will know that, hey, this is a reliable piece of information. Another piece of information might be less reliable. So you can capture that reliability information about that data itself, right? Metadata about the stuff that you're putting into your model. Attack graphs. So here I've labeled some paths in red, right? An attack graph organizes the different steps of the attack, and it allows us to think about the security again from the point of view of the attacker, and that's helpful. We can introduce some element that will break the path through the attack graph, okay? For example, we might do a better job of securing the key, okay? We might make sure that, the key goes onto a hook somewhere in a lockbox, and then, that lockbox uses a code that only a couple of people know, so that you can't necessarily get to that key. And then we can amend the attack graph to take our new security stuff into account. And that amendment then changes what's going on. So up in the graph, I have colored in red the paths that are non-zero, right? Piggyback, we decided it was 0. We don't care about that. So suppose you have a very detailed attack graph. Maybe you got it from observing lots of attacks. That's what MITRE and others are trying to do. And suppose that you have a lot of alerts arriving in your SOC. So I got a detailed attack graph, but I've also got tons of alerts pouring in on me, right? That's that false positive problem we saw before. If the actions in the attack graph can be correlated to the alerts we're receiving, then you can recognize attacks. This is really powerful, right? An event might just be some random event, but if I know it happened after this other event, which occurred after this other event, I'm like, oh wait, this fits a path in my attack graph. Maybe this attack is happening and I should take some action. And in fact, there are tools that do this kind of analysis. This helps you because it reduces the volume of alerts you're getting, but it also means that I'm going to wait for a while before I trigger an alarm, which allows the attacker to operate undetected for some period of time. And the attacker is always learning. So because they can operate for a little while before detection, they may learn things about your system that even though you kick them out, they can come in faster or more easily next time, perhaps not detected, and do some harm. So there's a trade-off here. Okay, suppose the attacker attempts to pick the lock and they fail. They go in, they have they think maybe 10 minutes before someone comes along, and they pick. They can't get one or two of the things to bite, and so they give up. So they go away, but they know something. They know, for example, the kind of lock it was. They may not have known that in advance, so they went in with a general set of picks, and they're like, I needed to have a better hook, or maybe a smaller torsion wrench because the one I have is too thick, it's getting in the way. And so they can then go off, they can get one of those locks, and they can practice on that lock and get pretty good at the feel for that lock, even though it's they're keyed differently. They can get good at that feel for that lock find out if a particular kind of rake or something is better for it. And they've gained information. So when they come back to try again, the probability isn't 50%. Maybe the probability is like 90%. Okay? Attackers gain information even when their attacks fail. So you thwart an attack, but the attacker may come away smarter than when they started and be able to attack you again. So what you need to do is to design systems in such a way that you provide the least information possible to an attacker. And you've got to balance this with the overall utility of your system and your own ability to diagnose problems. We talked last time about looking at error messages and log messages to try to find useful information. Okay? You still need that stuff because you still got to diagnose client problems. But, you need to find a way to balance this, to think, what information am I giving away? How can I do that in a way that communicates less information to an attacker? Maybe instead of having a very specific type of message, I use some numerical code because I can look that up in the database, but it's not going to be meaningful to an attacker. And this gets back to this idea of utility versus confidentiality, right? We think of the information we need to protect as confidential information. But, right, attackers might be looking at the metadata about that information. So they might be looking at other properties, side channels of our system like time and power that we haven't secured because we don't think they're important. So you should also give some thought to side channels in your design. All right, let's go back to attack graphs and let's think about the different ways that we can build attack graphs. And the most common way to try to build an attack graph is to start out and say the nodes represent security states. So I think about the different states of my system. Right? I have a door. The door is locked or the door is unlocked. I have an account. The account is secured or its account's been unlocked by a password. I have a server, right? No one is logged into the server or the attacker has now gained a foothold on that server. Okay, a file is encrypted or it's unencrypted. A data stream is encrypted or unencrypted. Edges in this graph represent actions to be taken by an attacker. Now, the good thing about this is it's very concrete, but it can be hard to develop, right? The nice thing about the divide and conquer approach we had earlier, where at the very top we said, I'm going to break into this computer, and I broke that down into subtasks. That's great. Those little pieces aren't all concrete. I don't reach concrete actions till I get down to the leaves. So I can combine the two approaches. I can start with the divide and conquer approach, identify intermediate states. I can maybe build more graphs for those until I have maybe a bunch of different attack graphs, and I combine them, and then I transition to this more rigorous attack graph after I've built out a number of attack trees. So, having done the initial graph, we can revisit it, and we might construct the graph you see over here. So at the very top, I have no access, right? Again, I want to get in that room and access that computer. Up at the top, no access. So I try to enter the facility. Two possible outcomes. The door is locked, the door is unlocked. But let's assume the door is locked. So that path now takes me to door locked. Okay, I could try to blackmail someone to get the door open, or maybe I blackmail them to just unlock the door, and then I open the door. Or maybe I piggyback, or maybe I pick the lock. And so I decide I'm going to try to pick the lock. Then if I'm successful, I get to the door unlocked state, and I can now open the door, which takes me to the door open state, which allows me to then enter the room. As I look at this graph, my goal may be to disrupt an attack. How do I disrupt the attacker? And so I would like to look for articulation points, places where a lot of the graph goes through a single node, right? Certainly that's the case for door open. Everything has to go through door open. So maybe what I do is I put detectors on the door. So the door is open, alarms go off. That's simple, right? That's great. That gives me an additional detection at an articulation point, at a point that's going to be on all the paths to let me detect it. And maybe that's the right thing to do here. Okay? So an attack graph turns out to be more useful than the attack tree, but it's harder to construct and it can be more complex. And because of this, you're more likely to get things wrong. So start with something simple like an attack tree. Build that out. Maybe for parts of that, you build out other attack trees, right? Part of it is I need to pick the lock. What does that look like? Well, I've got to have these kinds of tools. I've got to get them in this way. I have to do this process, okay? Great. And so you're building out each one of these little pieces. And at the end, then maybe you have enough information to turn that into an attack graph and then examine the attack graph to look for critical paths, to look for choke points, etc. in it. Attack graphs can be formalized, and there are, in fact, formal models of attack graphs. And the nice thing about the formal models is you can use them with automated systems to do things like we talked about earlier, to detect attacks, to compare the cost of different solutions, to measure the value of different security approaches, etc. Now, attackers can do this too, right? We've been building attack graphs and attack trees, and the idea is we're thinking like an attacker. That's what the attacker is going to do, so they can use the same kinds of tools. The other challenge is, for many systems, attack graphs get complex very quickly. That's a real attack graph that you see here. The better the information you have, the worse things get. This is the case where having lots of information can absolutely sink you because you end up building this massive complex attack graph that you can't analyze or really use effectively. So you have to watch out for that. This homework due on October 1st. The homework is to go and use ThreatDragon to do just some simple threat modeling. Some of you have already done this and turned it in, which is awesome. Kind of surprising. Someone did it like that same day that I gave the, like, what's that, like an hour of it, which is great. Go and build a threat model. Build a threat model. You should create an actor, a process, and a store. And again, I'm going to give you my view of the graph, put that into the tool, and then walk through each one of these pieces and use stride on that element. Not all of the stride pieces apply to every element. So, for example, you see that for actor, only spoofing and repudiation apply. Try to think of at least one threat of the appropriate type for every element. So for the user, try to think about spoofing or repudiation and how that might work. Once you're done, export the model as PDF and then upload it as your solution. There you go. And that's it.